in this instance, underwater natural springs that flow underground, flowing from the higher ground out near Tully, Lafayette, Pompey, in that area, wash through the rock salt, turned from fresh water into brine, into salt water, and came out near the shore of Onondaga Lake. Literally broke the surface. And that water, that brine, was much saltier than seawater. You took a gallon of seawater and a gallon of brine from the shore of Onondaga Lake, and you boiled it down, evaporated the water, you'd get much more salt out of the gallon from Onondaga Lake shore than you would out of seawater. And so that was the source. They had two ways of making salt, which we'll talk about in a minute. But of course, from a cultural standpoint, the lake's history really starts with Native Americans. There is evidence that there was Native American activity along the shores of Onondaga Lake as early as 10,000 years ago, in the prehistoric era, mainly as a source for fishing. There were fishing camps, temporary fishing camps that Native Americans would set up. Eventually, as the Native American culture developed, we get the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That confederacy of 5 nations, including the Onondaga Nation, which was the central nation, they formed their confederacy on the shore of Onondaga Lake. And the Onondaga Nation was, in fact, the capital, you could say, of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Their village was in the southern hills south of Syracuse, but Onondaga Lake was kind of their front door. This is the way they traveled on Onondaga Lake. They did not use birch bark canoes, they used elm bark canoes. And from Onondaga Lake, you could go into the river system, and you could go to many places throughout North America from there. We have to also remember that the Onondaga Nation is still here. They live on their territory. I'm sure, being from the Lafayette area, you're familiar with the Onondaga Nation territory. That land that is the Onondaga Nation has always been their land. It has never been anybody else's land except theirs. This is an image of Faithkeeper Warren Lyons. Because of the importance of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the early colonial era of the French and the English struggling for control of North America, the Iroquois sort of got caught up in that. As early as 1615, this is a view, a very stylized view from a European engraver, showing a battle along the shore of Onondaga Lake. You see Onondaga Lake at the top of the image. This is a representation of an Iroquois village, not particularly accurate, but in Europe they didn't really know exactly what they looked like. This is Samuel du Champlain, the founder of Quebec, in conjunction with his Huron allies attacking this Iroquois village. You see the French soldiers with the muskets arrayed along. They even constructed a little siege tower like you would if you were attacking a castle over in Europe. So from as early as 1615, Onondaga Lake is figuring in this struggle between the French and the English, and that Onondaga Lake keeps popping up well into the 18th century as the French and the English kind of maneuver for control and friendship and allyship with the Iroquois nation. I talked about the salt industry. After the American Revolution, the American government and the New York State government created territories for the Onondagas, series of land claims and treaties that are still being debated today. But the state was able to open up the shore of Onondaga Lake to salt manufacturing. This depicts the 2 different kinds of salt manufacturing. And the bottom in the middle, you see what were called boiling blocks. That was one of the ways they made salt around Onondaga Lake. At one time, at the peak of the industry in the 1860s, that era, there were close to 300 of those boiling blocks. As you see, they were lined up with big kettles that would hold the brine. They'd light a fire underneath at one end. The heat would be drawn down to a tall chimney. On the left side, you see some of the boiling blocks lined up along the Erie Canal. And that heat going under those kettles would evaporate the brine and create the salt crystals, which then could be shoveled out and put in the bins on the side to dry. The other way they made salt here was called solar evaporation, using essentially solar energy. You take the brine, you spread it out in these shallow vats, let it sit there with the sun and the wind working on it for several weeks, and eventually the water part evaporates and you're left with salt crystals, and then could go out in the upper right there and literally rake the salt to the end of the shed and then it would be loaded away. The salt industry lasted from the 1790s until 1926 around the shore of Onondaga Lake. Eventually lost out to competition from cheaper sources of salt elsewhere. The lake also had, so from the beginning, the lake is viewed as this industrial economic source. But it also had an era where there was some recreation that occurred around the lake. The iron pier that you see here, this is a very stylized view. The artist is using a lot of his imagination here. All of these different things that you see depicted here did occur on Onondaga Lake, but sort of not all at the same time like he's depicting here. The iron pier sat right where Destiny USA or the Carousel Mall, whatever you want to call it. And this was a place where you could take a streetcar or a train from the city to the iron pier and then get on a boat and go out to other resorts that were on another part of the lake. There's the steamboat going over to one of the resorts. One of them was White City. These were resorts on the lake that were not really bathing beaches. People didn't really think of the lake too much as a place to go swimming because of all the industry that was around it. They would go out, as you see there, the ladies in their long 1890s turn-of-the-century gowns. They didn't go swimming. They'd ride on the rides. There were bowling alleys. There were dance halls. There were places to drink beer. There were entertainment of different kinds that occurred at the resorts, but they weren't primarily places to go swimming to a large degree. There was even at one time a baseball park out there. You see the lake in the distance. If you sort of know where the regional market is, which is kind of across the street from Destiny USA, that's right where that baseball stadium was, Star Park it was called. One of the big changes that occurred in Onondaga Lake, as the salt industry started to slowly peter out after the Civil War, there was a new industry that came in called the Salve Process Company. The Salve Process Company, the Salve process was a process, a chemical process invented by two brothers in Belgium whose last name was Salve, hence the Salve process. And what it was a artificial means of making soda ash by chemical process. Soda ash can be mined, but it also can be produced chemically. Soda ash is an ingredient that's used in a lot of other products to make, for example, glass and other things. And the first process, the first artificial Salve process plant in America was on the shore of Onondaga Lake. Why? They needed a couple of different things for the Salve process. They needed brine to make the chemical reaction. They knew there was brine here. They needed limestone. There's a lot of limestone out in the hills south of Syracuse, which they could quarry and bring in. They needed fresh water for part of the process, which they had with Onondaga Lake, and they needed good transportation. And by this period in the 1880s, when the plant opened up, you had not only canal transportation, but you had railroad transportation. So they were making soda ash, but part of the process, at the end of the process, you wound up with this sort of waste material, almost like a toothpaste-like material. And they started just dumping it on the shore of Onondaga Lake, hence what were called the waste beds. And you see in this image here, the plant up in the upper right corner with the lake in the distance, and then this aerial view showing the growing waste beds, the one there in the middle almost extending halfway across Onondaga Lake. Not a particularly pleasant aspect of the lake with this pollution. After a while, they also started to sneak other things into the waste going into Onondaga Lake, including mercury. At the same time, down at the southern end of the lake, way down in the right-hand corner, there was an outlet from Onondaga Creek where a lot of the city sewage was going into the creek. Later on, there was a sewage plant built there, but even that was putting a different kind of sewage into the lake. So by the 20th century and the mid-20th century, Onondaga Lake is becoming one of the most polluted lakes in North America. What's happening along the shoreline? Well, by the early 20th century, the salt industry is dying out, and all these solar sheds, and there were 50,000 of them at one time, start to be abandoned and look like this. And so there's a lot of land available around Onondaga Lake. Do they decide to make it into a park on the waterfront? So Syracuse has a waterfront park? No, as you see here in this 1902 headline, not machinery hums where once the sun rays made salt. A lot of that area where all the solar salt sheds were along the shore of the lake The solar salt sheds are made out of wood, they get knocked out of the way, and this was an era of great industrial growth in America in the late 19th, early 20th century. And all of these factories start going into that relatively cheap land, filling in, again, between the downtown, the city, and the lakeshore. And in 1902, it was very appropriate to show a smokestack billowing out lots of dark smoke, because that meant that the economy was booming. Today we look at that and we think pollution. This is that industrial district. It's an area that's now called Franklin Square. It's kind of between downtown and Destiny, USA. And a whole number of factories went into that area very quickly, right after the beginning of the 20th century. Up in the left-hand corner, you see one of the products that they made there. These were power forging hammers. You all know a blacksmith, when he's working, he has a hammer like that. Well, you know, a blacksmith can only hit so hard. These were powered by steam engines, and they could bring thousands of pounds of pressure down for manufacturing large things. So this was just one product that was made in the Franklin Square area, and these forging hammers were shipped all over the world. Another change that came to the shore of Onondaga Lake, we know about the Erie Canal. There was the Oswego Canal, which went from Syracuse up to Oswego. But in 1918, the New York State replaced those old 19th century canals with the barge canal, which is still in existence today. And they decided, Syracuse said, we need a harbor on the barge canal. Now the barge canal runs kind of way up north of Syracuse, up near Brewerton and Baldwinsville and up that area. So they used the river system to hook Onondaga Lake into the barge canal, make it part of the barge canal, and then dredge a channel right into the heart of the lakefront to create the barge canal terminal. And this is an image. They actually built boats there at one time. They also unloaded cargo there. But it turned out that the most economical thing to use for the barge canal terminal was oil. They did bring in lumber, they did bring in coal, but eventually that became more efficient to transport by train or by truck. The thing that seemed to make sense, at least in the early 20th century, was oil for gasoline, for heating homes, and so forth. So the oil would literally come in on barges, which would come into the barge canal terminal and unload. And so where did they unload to? They needed all of these oil storage tanks, which then trucks could come and take it from the storage tank and deliver it to different places. So the inner harbor area that used to be covered with salt sheds turned into Oil City, what people used to call Oil City, with hundreds of these oil storage tanks. And way up at the top, very top of the image, you might just get a little sense of the edge of downtown Syracuse. Well, people sort of thought, okay, we got a solvent process polluting Onondaga Lake, we've got oil storage tanks up there, so we don't really care what else goes up around the shore of Onondaga Lake. So around the turn of the century, they built an actual garbage plant up on the shore of Onondaga Lake. And then later on, in the 1930s, they constructed a gasification plant, a plant that could make gas, like you turn your stove on. They made it by burning coal. Now today we get gas from natural gas that's mined, but back then they could make it by a gasification process. And so the shoreline of Onondaga Lake is really by the early to mid 20th century, sort of this area that's been consigned to be polluted and forgotten about. If you want a nice clean lake to live next to, or to go swimming in, or to enjoy from a recreational standpoint, you have Oneida Lake, you have Cazenovia Lake, you have Skaneateles Lake, you have lakes in Tully. And so those alternatives sort of let the community say, we can sacrifice Onondaga Lake. Now that's not to say that there weren't some visionary people that said, we ought to try and do something with the lake shore, a little more positive than solvent process plants and waste beds and oil storage tanks. And so in the late 1920s, where the old Oswego Canal ran along the shore of the lake, and it ran all the way along the east shore of the lake up through Liverpool and north of there, that was abandoned, remember? The state built the barge canal, so they didn't need the old Oswego Canal, and they just abandoned it, and it was left to rot. And so